So I'm very pleased to welcome Tomás Jiménez, who is professor at Stanford. Tomás, why don't you tell us, what is your role at Stanford? How do you describe what you do?
So my title is Professor of Sociology and Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. And I write about, I teach, I do research on immigration and race. And so that's my title, but what I'd like to think that I do is I peddle understanding. I had a long conversation with a friend of mine who's a faculty member at the law school, and he said the goal of teaching should not be to come to consensus, but to come to greater understanding. And so I'd like to think in a more general sense that's what I do.
So when you look, I mean, dealing with immigration and race and all those things that you study all the time, that is part of our everyday conversation. That's what we're talking about all the time. And I want to start, because I know we're going to get to some things that aren't as hopeful, but I want to start with this. What signs of hope do you see in our sort of national conversation about race and how we talk about it together, how we're living that out? What signs of hope do you see?
Yeah, I mean, I see the signs of hope everywhere. You know, in the last 5 years, and I would say more acutely in the last 2 years, the consciousness of the nation has been raised like never before seen in my lifetime, and perhaps in no one's lifetime in this room. With the killing of George Floyd, the killing of Breonna Taylor. We've seen people take to the streets. We've seen people have a renewed interest in bringing about greater racial justice, and not just people who might be the direct beneficiaries of that justice, but some of us who may not be the obvious beneficiaries. Now, I would argue we'd all be the beneficiaries of bringing about greater justice. I think that doing so helps us and enables us to live out our creed as a nation. But the fact that it's the consciousness raising has taken place across such a broad swath of the population, I think is incredibly hopeful.
Okay, I like that answer a lot, and that is very hopeful, and I wish we could stop there. But the next question is very obvious. So what is it that's keeping us? What's holding us back? What are the obstacles, and what are the challenges that keep us from making more progress?
Well, I have a really simple answer to this, Dave, and it'll just take me 30 seconds to figure it all
Perfect.
out.
Yeah, that'd be great.
No, let me just provide a couple caveats. So the first goes back to what I said a second ago about the fact that I think I peddle understanding. And the second is that what I'm about to say, I think, really speaks to my people. That is, and this will not shock any of you, people who are on the political left, many of us in this room, people who have had their consciousness raised a great deal recently. I'm not speaking to the Tiki Torch marchers in Charlottesville. And so I see a few obstacles. The first, and this is really about the conversation we're having about race and not so much about kind of moving policy, although I think they're related. So I think the first obstacle is that we're not leaving enough space for people to be confused. I think a lot of us are confused. I spend my entire life, my professional life, studying these issues, and I'm confused. And I don't think we leave enough space for people to ask questions, to be in dialogue, to come to a greater understanding. And I think it actually has to do partly with that raised consciousness, that so many of us so recently have had our consciousness raised that we think that we have to project some certainty. We may have a moral clarity about these issues, but we often, I think, project our certainty as a kind of cover for our own confusion. And I think that we have to give space for ourselves and for each other to be confused, but not to rest in that confusion, but rather to have a dialogue, to have a conversation that brings about some greater understanding. I don't think we do that enough. We leap to condemnation. We leap to kind of binaries of, you know, people who are in and out, who are devout, who or not, who have the right beliefs or who don't. I have three things, Dave. I have three things that I can keep going.
Good, keep
I'm
going.
used to giving hour-and-a-half lectures, so you know the fact that we
don't have that kind of time.
20 minutes
yes.
is absurd. I need at least an hour and a half. No, I would say the second thing is that we're too comfortable with the symbolism, and we need to lean more into the substance. You know, I think lawn signs and profile pictures on Facebook are all fine, but that's not a substitute for substantive change. And that we invest so heavily in the symbolism of what we say, of how we project ourselves, that we forget that it doesn't necessarily change the substance. Now, I'm a sociologist, so I believe in the relationship between the symbolic and material worlds. But I think we invest too much in symbolism over substance. And then I think the third thing is that activism is not enough. Organizing is what we need. We have a lot of activists. We have a lot of people who are activists and not enough organizers. And I think they're not mutually exclusive, but they are not necessarily the same.
So organizers is a political act? Is that what you're saying? What kind of organizers are you talking about?
I'm talking about organizers who are making changes in their communities and their neighborhoods, people who are making political change, and that requires a collective effort. More than just, kind of posting things on Facebook and Twitter. It requires actually doing really hard work that brings about long-term change.
And that work can be tedious too, right? I mean, I think that's part of the problem.
Oh, it's incredibly tedious. It's incredibly frustrating. I think, being a student of immigration and, the sociologist, not a historian, but I know a little bit about the history, I am sometimes shocked by how long the struggles for meaningful immigration reform of the past took. I mean, it took decades of change, or civil rights took decades of change and decades of tedious struggle, and I think we forget that. And we should look to those folks and be inspired by their fortitude.
And when you look at immigration policy now or immigration issues, I think one of the things that always strikes me is that the issue is portrayed as incredibly divided.
Yeah.
And I know you and I have had conversations about this. How divided are we really on issues of immigration as a country?
Yeah, I think we're politically divided, and by that I mean our political elites seem to be really divided. But this is one issue, and there are others out there, where the political discourse among our elected officials don't really reflect what we think as a people. So, I have done hundreds of interviews with people about immigration, and these are, interviews that take place over an hour and a half. I've done survey research. I've done research involving experiments, and one of the things that I take from studying this issue from multiple perspectives is that the better angels of our nature really shine through, I actually think, when it comes to immigration, believe it or not, as a people. I know that's going to shock you. I mean, and it's funny.
I raise my eyebrows.
Yeah, no, I know, and understandably so. I mean, I get calls from media outlets. I just got a call the other day from somebody who wanted to do a podcast and wanted me to talk about why it is that we don't like immigrants in this country and why the media has such negative portrayals of immigrants. But when I look at the data that I've collected and analyzed, when I've looked at the data that other people have collected and analyzed, that's not really what shows through. The fact is that for the first time ever, the Gallup organization found that a majority of Americans either want more immigrants or the same number of immigrants. And they've been asking that question going back to the early 70s. A majority of Americans think that immigrants contribute more than they take away. A majority of Americans believe that we should have a pathway to citizenship for people who are undocumented. An overwhelming majority think that we should have a pathway to citizenship for people who came here as young children, including a majority of Republicans.
Is that true? Because when you say majority, there's always that. Is this like
absolutely.
A political 50.4% kind of majority?
No. Actually, on the legalization question, which for a variety of reasons I think is the most important policy dimension or policy issue when it comes to immigration, it's a really large majority. Depending on how you ask the question, you get 85% of individuals agreeing with that. And Republicans are actually divided. So in the last about 10 years, we've seen a sea change in attitudes about immigration, and that sea change has been driven largely by Democrats, by people self-described Democrats, who've become ultra-liberal in their attitudes about immigration. There actually wasn't a whole lot of difference between Democrats and Republicans going back not that long ago, and Republicans have kind of stayed steady. They've stayed mostly divided. So you get about 50-50 split on a lot of these questions among Republicans.
So if there's that much agreement, if there's that much, what is it that's keeping us apart? What can, or probably the more positive version of that is, what can bring us together more around this issue?
It's a tough. So let me just talk about the policy aspect.
Great.
And because I'm a sociologist, I have to lead with the negative first.
That's fair.
Yeah. So I think you don't see a lot of that translate into policy change because immigration's not really a winning issue. You have a kind of loud minority of folks who are wholeheartedly against it, and then a kind of loud minority on the left who are really in favor, and you can't really mobilize the middle, who I think have mostly reasonable attitudes about immigration. Having said that, I don't think you have to look much further than this church to see some of the things that we can do. So, Marty Dreyer and others were instrumental in our immigrant accompaniment campaign, and successfully led to an entire family of asylum seekers being granted asylum. We are going to have a wave of refugees that are already coming from Afghanistan. And I should say, by the way, there's so far bipartisan support for welcoming these refugees. And one of the things that the federal government is doing now is allowing for private sponsorship. So typically you have mostly religious organizations. There are 9 resettlement agencies. These are nonprofits, but the government's leaving space for people like us, families, to get together and sponsor a refugee family to do the kind of immigrant accompaniment that we did a couple years ago.
And I know they're doing a lot of that work up at Pacific School of Religion, and that's actually in our weekly e-news, more information about how you can support some of these programs. So when you think about how we talk about ourselves as Americans, sort of how we talk about ourselves as a country, I think of us as a nation of immigrants. Like that was the sort of image I was raised with. Is that still our story? Is that going away? Where do you see that in dialogue?
Yeah, so the first thing to say is that's a relatively new notion of American national identity, sort of post mid-20th century.
That's me.
That's you. That's you. Yeah, that's right. That's right. But there have always been a number of national stories, a number of national narratives, and they've always competed. The notion that we are a nation of immigrants is relatively new. It's one that a lot of us invest in. It's one that a lot of us believe in. But I think that part of why we're so divided right now is that we don't have a national story. There's no consensus on the national story, and maybe not even enough understanding about the various national stories that are out there. So the nation of immigrants is a viable story. It's one that a lot of us subscribe to, but there are competing stories, competing narratives that are invested in ethno-nationalism. So go back to the Tiki Torch marchers. And there are stories that we should be a nation that really doesn't invest so heavily in our group differences or even recognizes group differences, but be one nation, all American, and kind of ignore the differences that we either want to embrace or that track the kinds of inequalities that exist in American society. So, you look at states like Texas right now, a number of other states where they do, where the high school history textbooks are adopted at the state level, and they're quite literally fighting about the national story and what should be included and what can't. Think about the teaching of critical race theory, which everyone uses, but no one knows exactly what it means. Some people do. But canceling out any notion that we should teach racism as part of American history is really a battle about who we are as a nation.
So in your work, I know you do policy work, you do all these things sort of studying this. And I would imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, I would imagine you talk with a lot of people who either agree with you or are actually left of you in terms of their political leanings. And so how does the work you do, what do you do to try to sort of move the ball down the field, to make some incremental progress in some way? Are there things that you are working on or colleagues are working on that are trying to do this?
Yeah, so I'm working with a group at Stanford right now that we're collaborating, and this, for the folks who are to the left of me, would not really like to hear this, but we're working with USCIS, United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is an office within the Department of Homeland Security. But we're collaborating with them because one of the initiatives of the Biden administration is to encourage people who are long-term green card holders to become citizens. There are a lot of folks who just sit on their green cards, and even though they're eligible, they don't become citizens. So we're working with them on a large end study to try and nudge people along to see if there are really low-cost things that we can do to encourage people to become citizens. And I'm leading up the qualitative component. We're going to be doing a bunch of interviews. Also with the Immigration Policy Lab at Stanford, we're doing some work on something I just mentioned a second ago, which is what they call co-sponsorship, where kind of private parties sponsor refugees, and we're going to study how that works, what works well and what doesn't, to try and improve things. And then I've also been looking at, in some of my prior work, I have, shameless plug here, I have a book coming out next month.
I don't think that's shameless. I like that.
No, it's
That's an
pretty
important
shameless.
plug.
It's pretty shameless. I have a book coming out in a month that touches on some of the issues, and then I'm going to continue working out with the Immigration Policy Lab, where we're looking at how state, county, and city policies affect immigrants' health. And so there's been a lot, and we may talk about this in a second, but there's been a lot of policy action at the local level in the last 20 years, in both the kind of really, really unwelcoming direction, think of Arizona or Escondido, the city of Escondido a few years ago, and then in the really, really welcoming direction, think of the state of California or New Mexico or Illinois. And so we've been studying how those policies affect whether people feel like they belong, whether they create a backlash.
And what are you finding?
Oh,
You want to tell us a little bit? I want to hear
I'm
that.
glad you asked it. So in the book, we compared Arizona and New Mexico. Arizona has been the kind of epitome of the unwelcoming state, and New Mexico took a very different approach to state-level policymaking. And here we're talking about things like driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants, in-state tuition, in-state financial aid for undocumented immigrants. In Arizona, I would really need like an hour to list the number of things that they did in the span of about a decade to make for a really hostile context for immigrants. So we did a bunch of research in both these, but we did a big survey, we did an experiment, we did a bunch of interviews, and the upshot is that when there are welcoming policies, the welcoming policies don't just benefit the groups that you think they would benefit, which in our case were Latino immigrants and US-born Latinos, but also US-born whites. So it turns out that when welcoming policies are in place in a state, that everybody feels like they belong more. There are political divisions, to be sure, political divisions among whites, but the net finding, the net benefit accrues both to whites and Latinos. That is, we all feel like we belong in a place where immigrants are welcomed.
So when you look at Arizona, then, is it that white people feel like they belong more than immigrants, or what did you find there on that?
Yeah, so I mean, for that, I turned to the experimental work that we did, which was in both states. So we found that there were no differences by state, but that when we primed people to believe that their policymakers were going to make things even more welcoming for immigrants, and we measured their emotional affect, were they happy, were they sad, were they angry, and then when we measured whether they felt like they belonged more, which we measured by their likelihood of moving out of their state or suggesting that other people move, we found that when they're primed to believe that their states are going to be more welcoming, that they express more positive affect, emotional affect, and that they feel like they belong more. And that was true in both states. It's a bit technical, Dave.
I think that's very interesting. I think that makes sense,
Yeah.
and is very interesting. So I guess what I would say is, when I think about preaching, and when you and I talked about this, I said that the thing to sort of come with is, what is it that you want to communicate to us? When we think about our group of folks and the people in our community, what is it you would say people like us could do? Maybe you've already answered this, to make the biggest difference. Like if you could change one thing that we all do, or a couple of things that we all do, what would that be?
Wow, that's a big question. Did we rehearse this question, Dave?
I don't think we rehearsed this one, but I warned you about it.
You did warn me about it. For me, I actually think that there are people in our congregation who are answering that question. I go back to the work that Marty did, or the work that my wife Nova has done, and this is not necessarily has to do with immigration, but people kind of getting up and doing things without being asked, without being required. Nova did sidewalk serenades to people because they were feeling lonely in the pandemic. When a number of us participated in the effort that Marty led, and she inspired and cajoled us to do so. So, I mean, I look to the folks here. So I think there are things that we can do on the really grassroots level. And then I think that just going back to something I said earlier, that even on immigration, we need to leave space for people to be confused, and then believe in our ability, and this might sound like a pipe dream right now, but believe in our ability to persuade people, believe in our ability to actually convince people that this might be good for the country and good for them, and then to actually act on it. It's really difficult. Immigration is not a winning political issue. It's an issue that a lot of people don't necessarily feel passionate about unless political elites make a big deal about it. And so, I'm dancing around this question. As
No,
you
I
can
think that's
see,
a great
Dave,
answer.
like
And
like
I
a
would
good
say
politician.
it's a wonderful segue to our scripture reading, right? Which
Yeah.
was basically simple acts of service and compassion are what make the difference. Welcoming the stranger, feeding the hungry. These things are not out of our reach. They're very much within our reach. And I think that's part of the answer our faith gives is, if you're not sure what to do, show compassion. And it makes all the difference. And that's to people in need and also people who disagree with us. And that's when it gets much harder for a lot of us.
Yeah, and I mean, again, there are so many people who are doing wonderful work, and I guess I'll quote Mr. Rogers here when he said, look to the helpers. And there are a lot of helpers out here. I looked at Marty Sarai Espinosa Salamanca is here, who was our men's retreat guest speaker and a real leader in the Dreamer movement, and somebody who, I really look up to, even though I won't say how much younger Sarai is than me, but I look up to her because she is someone who I think understands the difference between activism and organizing. When there is a need, she leaps and she gathers people to follow her and does amazing work. And I should also mention Sarai became a citizen on Friday morning. So
hey, congratulations. Congratulations.
So what I do is I look to the helpers and I follow them. I hope to be a helper someday.
So here's a question. You talked about persuading people.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you've ever had an impact on somebody who really disagreed with you? Because I wonder that all the time. I believe in the idea of persuasion. I believe we can help each other grow and move each other, but it's hard to see sometimes. So have you experienced that?
Yeah. So I'll talk about a couple things. So one is a personal experience, and then I'll talk about how that personal experience reflects actually some of the social psychological research. So, I generally operate in a political bubble. Like, most of my classes, my students either agree with me or they're like further to the left of me, and I find myself having to kind of challenge them and channeling views I don't agree with. And so I don't actually have that many opportunities to persuade, but I have had a few. And there was one particularly poignant instance where it was a while ago when I was a professor at UC San Diego, and I gave a talk to the League of Women Voters about immigration. And in the audience were a group of Minutemen. I don't know if you remember the Minutemen, but these were mostly men who patrolled the border as part of a kind of citizen militia to keep out undocumented immigrants. And a couple of these guys came up to me and challenged me. And I listened to them. And I didn't say anything, and I listened, and I nodded, and I listened, and I listened. And then I shared what I thought, and then I asked them what they thought, and I was genuinely interested in their perspective. Now, I can kind of do that because I'm a sociologist, and, everybody always needs there's never a sociologist when you need one around, but here I am.
See, I just call you,
I'm glad,
so I feel
I'm glad you got the joke. But no, I listened to them, and I actually feel at the end of that conversation, I got through to them. Now, I might not have changed their minds, but I knew that they looked at me, somebody who represented a view that was diametrically opposed to their view as a human being and as somebody who was sensible. And that to me is really important. We can't even listen to each other if I don't think the other person deserves to be listened to and is sensible. And in fact, I think they thought I was so sensible that they invited me to come and spend a weekend with them. I did not take them up on that. I came home and told Nova that, and she said, "You will absolutely not be spending a weekend with them." It's cool.
Good
I
choice.
thought that was. And actually, that's reflected in the research. My good friend and colleague Rob Willer has done quite a bit of research on persuasion. And in an experimental setting, it turns out that if you just listen to people, they may not walk away persuaded, but they will walk away thinking that what you have to say is meaningful and valuable, hence coming to a greater understanding. It seems like common sense, but for some reason we don't practice the common sense.
Really bad at that sometimes.
Yeah.
Well, tell me this, and we could talk for hours, I know, but I want to ask you this, and I feel like that sort of leads me into, how does your faith relate to what you do? I know that for most professors, it's a hard thing to relate, but I would imagine that you see your faith reflected in the work you do, or maybe your faith impacts the work you do. Do you have a way you could describe that?
Yeah, I think it's both things. So some of you may know that I grew up Catholic, going to the Catholic Church, and my father was a professor at Santa Clara. My mom worked at Santa Clara, so I grew up in the Jesuit tradition. And the Jesuit tradition says that you can't have justice without education, and that education better equips us to be the hands of Jesus in the world. And so that notion of the relationship between education and justice has always been with me. And as a professor, it's actually sometimes hard to see where those things connect. I spend so much of my time doing what feels like kind of esoteric work, spend so much time teaching students not really knowing, occasionally seeing the impact. But I have to believe that in teaching those students and in the effort to create some understanding in the academic community and also beyond, that I'd like to think I'm doing that work. But I also feel like my faith, especially recently, informs the way that I'm approaching my research. So, you know, I'm a middle-aged man. I'm getting personal here. I hope this is okay. I'm taking off my expert hat.
It was a personal question.
Okay,
yeah.
okay. You know, I'm a middle-aged man with a fancy job at a fancy school, and like a lot of people my age, kind of thinking about what are we supposed to be doing in this world. And when I come to this community for answers, if not challenge, for how to answer that question. And so your sermons, watching the work that other people do, watching my wife do her work, like that challenges me to think about how my research might actually do something more than just add another line on my CV. And so, and it is really coming here and being in this community and hearing from you and Eileen and others that has challenged me, and I think led me to actually do a pretty strong pivot in my research. For the bulk of my career, my research has really been the kind of ideas for ideas' sake, and I love ideas. I can talk ideas all day. I love talking ideas, and I still do. But that pivot has been much more to what we call impact research, much more toward thinking about the questions that matter in the world, and then partnering with organizations like USCIS, like Welcoming America, which is an organization that organizes cities, counties, and states to initiate welcoming policies, to figure out how I can use my research to help advance those agendas. It's not easy. It's really hard work. It's messy work, but this is a shameless plug for Stanford too. But Stanford is, I think, maybe in some ways an institutional mirror image of me. They're offering a lot more on-ramps for faculty to do that, and recognizing that, you know, faculty are people too, and we keep learning, and we need opportunities to shift and change, and so they've offered some of those opportunities, and I'm really grateful for that.
Fantastic. I think as you were talking, I couldn't help thinking, and again, this is occupational hazard on my end, but I couldn't help thinking of the parable of the sower, right? We don't get to decide how the seeds grow that we plant. We have to plant the seeds and then have some faith that they will, some of them will grow, and a lot of them won't. A lot of them are going to get choked or, you know, burnt by the sun or all those things in the parable. But if we plant enough seeds, right, some of them are going to grow. And I think about that in terms of ministry. It sounds like that's what you think about in terms of your work. And I think that's the invitation to all of us, right? We plant the seeds, and we can't force them to grow. We can't decide exactly how they grow, but we can keep planting seeds. And as Jesus says, we reap, we harvest what we sow. What we plant is what is going to be in our lives. So if we plant seeds of compassion and love and listening and generosity, it's going to grow in our lives. And if we plant seeds of condemnation and judgment, right, those things are going to grow in our lives. And we're doing a lot of that right now. So
can I riff off of that for a second, Dave? I know I can tell you're
not wrong.
You're wrapping up, but I will make it quick. So, and you know, I think one of the lessons that I've learned in my teaching, and also just kind of paying attention to the world around me, is we never know what kind of impact we're going to have. So if you lead with love, if you lead with generosity, lead with compassion, lead with understanding, you may not see the results immediately, but somewhere down the road, the flowers will blossom. And I'll just give a quick example. So my dad is here. My father, as some of you know, was a professor at Santa Clara, a dreamer himself, who was undocumented for much of his childhood. And he writes about those experiences. And one of the things he writes about are his teachers, and teachers who stayed with him at lunchtime to help him learn how to play the trumpet, or stayed with him after class to help him read. And these are people who had no idea what kind of impact they would have. They just thought they were helping a Mexican kid learn how to read or play the trumpet, and then he moved off, and they had no idea what happened to him. And the impact is enormous. The impact that it had on his life, the impact that it has on my life, my children. And so I think
and then everybody you impact.
And so I think that's a perfect example of the parable.
Amen. Well, we will leave it there. Will you join me in thanking Tomás for sharing this with us? Thank you.